can you knit without looking at your knitting? Can you knit in the dark? Can you knit at the cinema? Can you knit out and about without feeling self-conscious? Can you knit while talking to other people? In today's video, I'm going to talk about knitting without looking and give you some advice on how to practice getting used to knitting without looking, and share some of my top tips. I'm going to put this down. This is a sweater I'm working on, and I'm going to put it down because it's getting quite heavy, and for order for you to see me knitting I have to hold it up quite high, and that's hurting a little bit because the whole thing's a bit heavy. I probably should have picked a sock to knit on instead. Welcome to today's video. If you're new here, my name is Anniken. I design knitting patterns, I teach knitting workshops online and in person, and I sell yarn through my website YarnAddict.co.uk. Thank you very much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you like it, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing. So today I'm going to talk about knitting without looking. I actually wrote down a whole script, or like a list of things I want to talk about in this video a few weeks ago. And then I thought, haven't I done a video on this before? So I checked, and yes, I did do a video. I think it was like in 2016 or something. I can't remember. It's a few years ago, I think. And I actually sat back and I listened to it and I watched it. And I realized that there were some things I'd planned to talk about in this video that I didn't talk about last time. So I kind of hesitated, and I thought, no, let's film it and post it anyway, because I have a lot more followers here now than when I posted the last video. So some of you may have seen it, some of you may not. If you have seen it, I hope you can still benefit from this video. I'm sorry about the light. It's kind of, the lighting outside is changing, which makes the light in here change. It's a bit dark here, but my main light bulb is gone and I keep forgetting to change it. So I do apologize. The lighting situation is a little bit rubbish in here at the moment. Let me just see if I can move my ring light and make it slightly better. Anyway, if you liked today's video, give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing. So let's talk about knitting without looking. So I knit in public a lot, and I get people commenting on how fast I knit a lot, and I also get people commenting on the fact that I'm knitting without looking. So last week I was in a pub waiting to meet a friend, and I was just sitting there knitting. I can't remember what I was knitting on. I think it was this sweater, but I wasn't as far on it last week. And it's just stocking stitch in the round, so you're just knitting. And I was just in there knitting, just looking around, glancing out to the street to see if my friend was coming, because she was running late, looking at other people in the pub, just sitting there kind of daydreaming, looking, and not really looking at my knitting. And one of the young women behind the bar came over to me and said, I've been watching you knit and I'm fascinated about how fast you knit. She said, I thought my aunt was the fast knitter, but you're much faster, and also you're not looking at it most of the time. So we had a nice little chat, and I do get comments like that quite a lot when I knit out and about. And I knit just about everywhere. In the past I've knitted in church, I've knitted with friends while having a conversation. I mean, I frequently do that. I've knitted in meetings, I've knitted while watching TV, I've knitted at cinema in the dark, I've knitted in poor lighting, I've knitted on airplanes, I've knitted on beaches, by the pool, I knitted in my hospital bed a couple of hours after having my gallbladder removed. That's when they decided I was probably well enough to go home, was when they saw me knitting in my bed. I basically knit everywhere, in coffee shops, hospital waiting rooms. I knit. I know I have to be sitting down for a long time, I'm probably going to be knitting. I do know that some people, if you are knitting while you talk to them and you're looking at your knitting and not at them, get a bit annoyed because they think you're being respectful. I've heard of people who've knitted in meetings and people have complained saying they're not paying attention or they're not listening because they're looking at their knitting and they don't look like they're paying attention to the person speaking. But we do listen with our ears, not with our eyes. So you can look at your knitting and still pay attention to what's being said. But most people, when you're talking to them, or if you're in a meeting or you're at a talk or something and you're listening to people speak, they do like it if you watch them and not knit. Because I guess especially if you're talking to like a big group of people looking at you makes you feel like they're paying attention more than if they're looking at something else, even though I know we listen with our ears and not our eyes. But it is useful to be able to knit without looking. If you want to knit at the cinema, for example, you're going to have to learn to knit without looking because it's going to be dark, so you can't look anyway. If you want to knit while watching television, it's probably a good idea to be able to knit without looking. I can definitely do stocking stitch, both knit and purl, and rib. Like if it's a regular rib where I'm doing knit 1, purl 1 and knit 2, purl 2. If it's a rib that says like knit 2, purl 2, knit 3, purl 2, knit 2, purl 2, knit 3, like a bit more irregular between the knit and purl stitches, it's a bit more difficult. But if I know I'm doing like knit 2, purl 2 or something like that, then I find it quite easy to knit rib without looking. Lace knitting is a little bit more difficult. I can knit lace and not have to look at it every single stitch, but I can't knit lace and not look at it at all. So I wouldn't take a lace project with me to the cinema, for example, where it's going to be dark and I won't be able to look at it. But if I knit something that's fairly simple lace with a lace pattern that I can kind of memorize easily, and when I say memorize, I don't mean like memorize like I have to like say to myself in my head all the time, but I just kind of know what I'm doing based on the stitches that are already on my needles. I can do that without looking at it all the time, so I can knit a simple lace pattern or a moderate lace pattern while still watching telly at home, for example. Stranded colour work, I do need to look at it a bit more. I do find it more difficult to knit stranded colour work without looking. Brioche depends on what it is. If it's just a plain 2-colour brioche rib, then I can look at it without, I can knit without looking at it too closely. You know, I've just glanced down occasionally. I haven't tried to knit brioche in the cinema yet, and I don't think I will try that. But I can do brioche without looking at it all the time. If it's a brioche pattern that has a pattern, so like increases and decreases to create a fancy pattern, then I would need to look at it when I do those decreases and things. But for just a plain brioche rib bit, I could probably look at it, knit it without looking at it all the time. So it just depends on what I'm doing, whether I need to look at it all the time or whether I can just glance up and down every now and then. I've suffered with chronic neck pain since I was 14 years old after a car accident, and then I had another car accident when I was 30 and I hurt my neck even more. So from like a teenager, anything that involved me looking down for a longer period of time, and when I say longer period of time, I'm probably at the point now where even just looking down for like 5 minutes is making my neck hurt. But when I was a teenager, I could look down for a bit longer. But I did find that anything that involved me looking down would make my neck hurt. And when I had the second car accident, I'd actually not been knitting for a few years because I just got out of knitting a bit in my 20s. But I got into doing cross stitch, and I had to stop doing cross stitch because after I had the second car accident when I was 30, because with cross stitch I had to look down. Even if I had it on the frame and I had it in front of me, I didn't have one of those big freestanding frames that you can like prop up in front of you. That might be better. I just had one of those circular frames, like the one that's like that, but bigger. And so I had to hold it in front of me, but you know, it's not that easy to hold it up like that while you're sewing, so it would be lower down. Then I'd end up looking down, and I was actually working on a project for my mum. It was supposed to be a present for my mum, and I had to give up and not do it. The light's gone all funny again now. That's a bit better. Okay, so apologies about the lighting. So I had to stop doing it because I just couldn't. It was just hurting my neck too much. And when I got back into knitting again, I was worried I wouldn't be able to do it, but I realised as long as I tried not to look down too much, I could do it. So when I knit in my comfy chair, I actually rest my arms on the armrest, and I try and hold my knitting kind of chest height, so I don't have to look down as far. I can just glance down like that. But I got used to, when I first got back into knitting again, I was trying to watch telly while I was knitting, because that would automatically draw my attention and my focus to the television, and I would then look straight ahead at the television rather than looking at my knitting. So I do find that if I'm not talking to anyone or I'm not watching telly or anything else, if I'm just sitting on my knitting or listening to an audiobook or something, I do look at my knitting more than if I'm watching telly or talking to somebody where my attention has to be on something else. When I first started knitting while chatting to friends, I was worried that they would think that if I was looking at my knitting, I wasn't focusing on them. So I was trying really hard to focus on them and not look at my knitting too often. And the same thing when I first started knitting in church. I was worried that the person preaching would think that I wasn't concentrating if I was looking at them. If I was looking at my knitting, sorry, so I would try and just like knit, but like stare at the person, not stare, but like look at the person preaching the whole time rather than my knitting. Whereas loads of people in the church we used to go to used to take notes during the sermon, so I was looking at the person preaching more than they were, but some people probably thought I paid less attention, which I don't think was true. But I did used to knit during the sermon because we used to go to church that had very, very long sermons. So what can you do if you want to get used to knitting without looking? I'm going to share some of my top tips. So start to use your fingers to actually feel what's happening. So as you're knitting, use your fingers to feel what's happening on your needles. Try and feel each stitch. Try and, if you're doing rib like knit 2 purl 2, try and feel what's a knit stitch and a purl stitch. You can't feel it because the purl stitches retract and the knit stitches kind of pop out, so you can feel it. If you run your fingers across a rib, you can feel it. Obviously things like color work is more different because it just feels the same. I can't feel which color is which, but with rib you can feel the difference. So try and use your fingers to feel what's happening on your needles. Just use your fingers to see if you can feel the difference between a knit and a purl stitch. Can you tell rib from stocking stitch? Can you tell the knit side of a stocking stitch from the purl side? Can you feel when you've dropped a stitch? Try and feel all those things. So try and just use your fingers to be more aware of what your fingers are feeling as you knit. Start with something simple. For example, knit stitches, either knitting something in the round or the knit row of a stocking stitch knitted back and forth. So for most of us, I think it's easier to start with a knit stitch. Knit a few stitches, then look away and knit a few stitches. Look back at your knitting and check if you've made a mistake or dropped any stitches, and then carry on and just either look away or close your eyes. So you can knit 5 stitches, close your eyes for 5 stitches, open your eyes, check, knit for 5 stitches, close your eyes, and then try and go longer with closing your eyes and see if you can knit, or just look away. If you're sitting somewhere, you can just look out the window. If I was sitting here and knitting, I could just look out the window and see if I can still knit. Just try and take your attention away from your knitting and see if you can still knit what you're doing without dropping any stitches. I find it easier if I have something else to concentrate on. If I'm not looking at anything else, I will probably look at my knitting. So talking to a person or watching telly or something like that makes it a lot easier for me to not look at my knitting. So putting the telly on or having a conversation with somebody might encourage you to look away from your knitting more, and you might find that you are knitting without looking. You can do it better than you realize than just when you're trying to not look at your knitting, if that makes sense. Once you realize you can do knit stitches without looking, try purl stitches, and once you get a hang of purl stitches, try rib. So knit 1 purl 1 or knit 2 purl 2 is probably the easiest to start with because you don't really even have to count that much. If you're going to do, like, say, knit 4 purl 4, you have to count, which if you're trying to concentrate on something else or talk to somebody else, you don't want to be counting in your head the whole time because that kind of defeats the purpose of trying to concentrate on something else while you're knitting. Try closing your eyes while you're knitting, and then try closing your eyes while you're purling and see how long you can keep them closed for without dropping a stitch. And once you've mastered knit and purl without looking, try something more complicated. So try something you're already comfortable with. So if you've never done brioche knitting before, don't try brioche knitting for the first time without looking at it. As I said, stranded colour work I find very difficult without looking. Lace, I can do some lace knitting without looking, and I can do some brioche knitting without looking. But stranded colour work I find very difficult because the stitches all feel the same. But try just some simple stitch patterns. Whatever you normally do, try and see if you can do that without looking at it the whole time. You don't need to close your eyes, but just try and do it while you're focusing on the TV, and see if you can watch the TV more than you look at your knitting. Once I realised that I could knit garter stitch, stocking stitch, and rib in the cinema, I started knitting socks while we went to the cinema. I actually, the first thing I started knitting at the cinema was scarves. Many years ago, when I first got back into knitting, I was knitting some scarves, and they were just like the fake fur fabric that was like popular in the, I guess it was like the mid-noughties. I can't remember, a long time ago. I guess nearly 20 years ago. They were like those fluffy fake fur type yarns, very popular. I devised the pattern where I could knit a short scarf out of 1 50-gram balls on 8mm needles in garter stitch, and then I would knit a little bit, and I would cast off some stitches in the middle of the row, and on the next row cast them on again, so I get like a slit, and then I would finish the scarf, and then I'd thread one end through the slit, so the scarf just kind of sat nicely around my neck and then crossed over kind of here. And I knitted loads of those because I sold them to friends, neighbours, gave them away as gifts. I sold a load on eBay, and I could cast off one of those, knit it while I was at the cinema, and I could finish a whole scarf during a trip to the cinema. I guess what I must have done was cast it on at home, knit a few rows, do the cast off and cast on bit on the next row, and then knit the rest in the cinema, I guess. I can't remember. So that was the first thing I tried knitting in the cinema, and the reason I did that was because my neighbour ordered loads of them for Christmas, and then the next year she ordered more of them to give away for Christmas presents, and I got a bit bored with knitting them, and I was just like, oh, I really don't want to. And then we were going to the cinema, and I thought, oh, I wonder if I can take it to the cinema, then I can kind of knit it without having to pay attention to it. And then I realised I can knit a whole scarf while I went to the cinema. And then once I stopped making those scarves, I had to kind of find something else to knit at the cinema, so I started doing socks at the cinema. And normally I would just do like the plain bit, so like the leg or the foot where there wasn't any shaping or anything. But one time we were on a day out, and we decided to go to the cinema. We hadn't planned it. It was an impromptu thing. We saw one of the Bourne films. Remember those? And I had a sock with me. It's just me and Simon because the girls were away with their grandparents, I think. And I was about to start a heel flap. So I did actually knit the heel flap and the heel turn and probably part of the gusset in the cinema. I thought, well, I don't have anything else to knit, so I'm just going to have to try that. If it doesn't work out, I'll just rip it back, but at least I can knit while I'm watching the film. And they actually turned out okay. It wasn't perfect, but it was good enough for me. This is a long time ago, and it was a very small, like old-fashioned cinema, and it wasn't completely pitch black. I would say cinemas now, I think, are a lot darker than they used to be. This cinema, I think there was a little bit like spotlights along the aisle and things, because I used to quite often sit, even the cinema we go to most of the time, which is in Plymouth, they used to have like spotlights going down the stairs, so you could see like spotlights above the stairs, so if you had to leave during the film, you weren't going to fall down the stairs, you could see where you were going. And I used to always try and sit by the aisle so I could have that little tiny bit of light. But now it's pitch black where we normally go. There are no lights on at all, I don't think, during the cinema, apart from like where the emergency exit is and stuff, I guess. So it is darker now in the cinema. The most difficult thing I've knitted in the cinema was once we went to a local cinema in a local church hall. So it wasn't a proper cinema. And there was a little bit of light on, it wasn't completely pitch black. And I was doing a sweater which had like a cable up the middle of the front. I think it's just like one cable in the middle, and I did knit that, and it was fine except for one bit where I crossed the cable the wrong way. But I managed to just drop down the cable and fix it and carry on, so that was okay. One tip about knitting for the cinema is that if you think you've dropped a stitch, or if you do drop a stitch, because I knit for the stitches really close to my needle tips, I do sometimes drop stitches while I'm knitting at the cinema. and normally I can pick it up, even if it's unraveled a row or two, I can normally pick it back up while I'm at the cinema. I was watching somebody a few weeks ago, maybe a month or two ago, on YouTube, and she said that she dropped the stitch and she went out of the screen, out of the hallway, fixed it and went back in again. I've never done that. There has been times when I have made a mistake and dropped the stitch and I haven't been able to pick it up, and I've just put my knitting back in my bag and not knitted for the rest of the film. But normally I can fix it. One tip specifically for cinema knitting is that if you have a bright scene coming up, so the screen is very bright, if you hold your knitting up, you can quite often see through with the light shining on it from the back. You can quite often see if you've dropped the stitch or something and pick it up again. And I've certainly done that a lot of times, where I've waited for like a really brightly lit scene to come, so I can hold my knitting up and just quickly fix my mistake and then carry on knitting. I think I have also a couple of times when we've been the only ones in the cinema actually put my phone on just to quickly check if I've dropped the stitch or not, or if I know I dropped the stitch, I picked it up correctly. But I wouldn't do that if there was anyone else around, of course, because you don't want to annoy people sitting next to you and behind you. So those are my top tips for learning to knit without looking. Start with something easy, just stocking stitch. Start with knit stitch if you find that easiest. If you find purl stitch easier, start with purl stitch, and then just build on that. Don't expect to look at your knitting all the time to go from that to knitting in the cinema without anything in between. Just start practicing at home, and start just, it's something very simple. Stocking stitch in the round, for example, is perfect. And just not look at your knitting, look away, look out the window, close your eyes for a few seconds, and then check you haven't made a mistake, and then build on that, and then gradually make it more and more difficult. And if you're meeting a friend and you've never knitted in front of your friends before and you feel a little bit embarrassed, I used to sort of say to non-knitting friends, do you mind if I knit? And most of them are now used to me knitting. If I was meeting somebody new that I didn't know that well, I might say, do you mind if I knit while we chat? And most people don't mind, especially if you're looking at them. I think if you say, do you mind if I knit, and then you spend your whole time looking at your knitting, they might get a little bit annoyed because they might feel like you're not paying attention to them. But if you can knit and look at them at the same time, then I think most people are okay with that. So how do you try to knit without looking? Can you knit without looking? Where do you normally knit? Do you knit out and about? Do you only knit at home? Do you knit while watching telly? Do you avoid knitting watching telly? Have you tried knitting in the cinema? Share your experiences with me in the comments below this video. Apologies for the light in this video. We've gone from, like, it was quite cloudy and dark outside when I started filming, and now the sun's come out, so I've closed the curtain. But yeah, lighting is difficult in this room when the weather conditions are a bit inconsistent. But I really appreciate you joining me for this video. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Share any tips that you have that I haven't covered in this video. Share those in the comments below. And I will see you next time. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.